We are here with Justin Wolfers, who is at the University of Pennsylvania, and if I'm not mistaken, he is on leave to Princeton University at the moment.
That's absolutely right. Having a great time there.
Hello. What is your most important research finding?
The thing I think I'm most proud of is delving into the happiness, or the economics of happiness. I think the economics of happiness has had two great revolutions. The first, economists decided that happiness was interesting, and we jumped in. And we started off by getting a lot of very counterintuitive findings. And the most important of these was this thing called the Eastland Paradox. The Eastland Paradox was the juxtaposition of three things. First, it looked like rich people if you look within a society at a point in time, rich people are happier than poor people. And it looked like if you compared societies, Eastland failed to find any evidence that rich countries are happier than poor countries, or that through time, as countries get richer, that they got happier. That was the first great revolution. The second is actually empirical economists, like myself and Betsy Stevenson, started to then get involved and actually go back and I think try to bring the empirical tools of economics and try and get those first order facts right. And a lot of this is just very careful data work, trying to figure out what in fact is true about the relationship between well-being, happiness, life satisfaction and so on, and economic development. It turns out the Eastland Paradox, the facts that it was built on, the facts weren't exactly as we first thought they were. So it is absolutely true, rich people were happier than poor people. But it turns out in almost exactly equal measure, rich countries are happier than poor countries. And it also turns out in equal measure, as countries get richer, they also get happier. When you think about that, there's no paradox at all. It turns out that what economists have always suspected, greater opportunities, which we often evaluate or measure as greater income, gives rise to greater happiness. So the Eastland Paradox had led to exciting theorizing that maybe all that matters is how rich you are relative to the Joneses, or that we should stop economic development. But the empirical foundation on which that theorizing was based just turns out to be false. The answer turns out to be as simple as one of the most powerful forces raising well-being around the world is economic development, the higher opportunities and greater income that it gives.
Now, Easterlin says this is only short-term. In the long term, income doesn't matter.
Yeah, so there's been several responses to the first round of research we did on this. One was, people said, well, of course income matters, but it only matters up to some point. Maybe income matters up to $12,000, maybe $15,000. Beyond that, it doesn't matter. That's been a folk wisdom lots of people have talked about. And it turns out that it's something that no one had ever formally studied. We literally read the entire literature and no one ever tested, is there satiation? Is there some point where extra money doesn't matter? So we actually have gone back and we've systematically looked through literally every available data set. And it turns out that extra income buys extra happiness at every point in the income distribution. It never runs out. What we find is a 10% rise in income raises happiness by the same amount. So if you're extremely rich, it takes a lot of extra dollars to make you a little bit extra happy. But certainly the income-happiness relationship persists beyond any satiation point. A different line of criticism, this was Richard Eastland's, was that what we were finding was the ups and downs. The business cycles involve fluctuations, the ups and downs, and that when income rises in a boom and falls in a recession, happiness rises in a boom and falls in a recession. And so what we were finding was a short-run phenomenon, not a long run. It turns out that's just not true. Now, here I'm giving you a hint of our very next paper, and this is actually something we're going to release very soon. We've gone back and we've systematically collected every data set where we can follow countries through time. And now we can look at what's happening to happiness or life satisfaction and gross domestic product through time. And we can also account for or control for the business cycle by including controls. Econometrically, we also say what happens if we account for or control for unemployment and inflation. Or we can look just over very, very long periods. So rather than saying what happens between income and happiness over periods of 5 years, what happens over periods of 10 years, or in fact, one of the things we've done, this is the most exciting part, in fact, is we've found surveys from the 1950s and 60s of happiness, and we've matched them up to surveys from the 2000s of happiness. And so we're looking at changes in GDP over periods of 50 and 60 years, longer than anyone's ever looked at before. And we're matching those up to changes in happiness over the same period, and we're finding very strong, very robust relationships. So this is a paper I can't wait to release. We'll probably send it out in the next few weeks, showing very clearly that this time series relationship is just as strong as what we'd seen when we compared rich countries and poor countries.
So what is your policy advice?
On this particular one, let me say one part the negative and then one part the positive. So there had been an agenda that previous beliefs about what the facts were had led people to suggest. People had thought that if economic development didn't raise happiness, then economic development was a bad idea. We think that fact is just false. And if it's false, then the conclusions that follow from it are false. The implications that follow from it are false. So to the extent that happiness data had been used to argue for an anti-growth agenda, and Richard Eastland and many others had suggested that, including a fairly resonant story, in particular in Europe, we think that's just dangerous and wrong. Now, it's not, I don't want to go the next step and say that money is the most important thing and that's all that any of us should pursue. All that we find is economic development surely has the sort of payoff to well-being that all of us had anticipated all along. Why does income matter is a much, much harder question. So I'm not for a moment saying quit your job and become an investment banker. I think the reason that riches make us happier is because people with riches also have greater opportunities. And so one of the ways we spend those opportunities is not just in higher income, but sometimes we take time off. We spend time with our kids, or we take a job that we happen to find rewarding. And so I'm not for a moment suggesting that we should pursue income rather than anything else, but I do think that economic policies that expand the opportunity set for everybody are incredibly powerful. This really matters if you look at the very poorest countries in the world. These are countries where people are deprived of opportunities and people are frankly miserable. Recall a moment ago I said what matters is a 10% rise in income buys the same rise in happiness for anyone anywhere around the world. Well, it doesn't take a lot of dollars to raise the happiness of someone in Burundi. It takes a heck of a lot of dollars to raise the happiness of someone in the US or in Germany. So it still suggests that things like foreign aid could potentially be very powerful forces raising well-being around the world. So the world's poorest are definitely those where I think we have the greatest capacity to increase flourishing in all sorts of different dimensions, including happiness and satisfaction.
Thank you very much.
A pleasure.